All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're so glad that you were able to take time out of your day to join us. My name is Stephanie and I will be one of your co-hosts for today. Now, today's webinar is a part of our larger BrainHQ Academy series where we talk about the neuroscience behind different topics. Today's topic is a highly requested one and a repeat for us. It's called Music in the Brain, and we'll be talking about how our brains take in music and how listening to and playing music changes the brain. All right, so let's do a little bit of housekeeping. So to kick off the webinar today, we are going to be opening up with an activity called Name That Tune. Henry and I will sort of be co-running that. Basically, what's going to happen is there's going to be a tune that plays with a little video on screen. I'll turn on the chat feature, and then you can go ahead and type in what the name of the song is and the artist is, or who the artist is, rather. Following that, Dr. Henry Mahncke is going to give a presentation on music in the brain. Now, most of you probably already know Henry, but if not, Dr. Henry Mahncke earned his PhD in neuroscience at the University of California, San Francisco. That's where he studied brain plasticity, with our co-founder, Dr. Michael Merzenich. He has been running the show here at Posit Science since 2011 as our CEO. Hey, Henry, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Stephanie. Thanks for organizing and hosting everything today.
Yeah, of course. Then we are very excited to have a special guest with us today. Following the presentation that Henry's giving, we are going to be inviting Lois Narvy to join us in discussion. Now, Lois Narvy has a BM in harpsichord performance and graduate fellowship in harpsichord and forte piano performance from the University of Maryland. She studied at University of Manitoba, Banff School, and Kansas City Conservatory. Now, for more than 30 years, Lois has been working at the Levine Music School in Washington, D.C. And although she has taken on many administrative roles in her time at Levine Music School over the years, Lois has never stopped teaching and teaches as much as she can. So Lois, we are very, very excited to have you joining us today.
Great.
All right, then following that, we will go ahead and open the floor to any questions that any of our audience members may have, either for Henry or for Lois. Whenever you have a question throughout the webinar today, go ahead and click the little Q&A button on the Zoom control panel, and a window will pop up where you can type in your questions. I will be curating those questions, and I'll try to make sure that we get to as many of those questions as we can today. Now, the last thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. So if you want to see when that video goes live, you can head on over to youtube.com/brainhq and subscribe there to get a notification when that video is up. All right, so Henry, I think I'm going to go ahead and toss it to you. We can go ahead and start some Name That Tunage. Hey everyone, this is Stephanie coming to you from post-production. Thank you for joining the replay of our webinar on music in the brain. Now, here you might notice a brief jump in the recording around now, where an activity called Name That Tune should be going. Now, unfortunately, that section included copyrighted music that we aren't allowed to upload to YouTube at this time. So we unfortunately do have to cut this section for our YouTube audience. But don't worry, you haven't missed anything crucial. The information from the presentation is still coming up. So we would go ahead and encourage you to continue watching with the video. I just wanted to jump in and explain why the activity that we just announced in the agenda is not appearing here in the YouTube video. Thanks very much.
We're going to start actually by talking about, hey, what is sound and music exactly at the physical level and at the brain level? And I want to start off by saying that, hey, music starts off as a vibration in the air. And the easiest way to see that actually is to just watch a little tiny bit of this video. Let's see if I can get this started. Oh, I see. Here we go. Let's see. Why? There we go. Press play. Okay, so just in those two little measures of guitar music, we can see how music works physically at the instrument level and at the air level. So in a guitar, lower notes are actually at the top here and higher notes are at the bottom. And when you pluck that guitar, you can actually see, and I've frozen it at a good time, you can actually see how the string is vibrating. And as that string vibrates, it is actually, of course, pushing molecules in the air back and forth. And that is fundamentally how sound and music starts, is it's a vibration in the air. And what that vibration does is it pushes molecules in the air back and forth, creating kind of zones of pressure at certain frequencies. And of course, for a lower note, we see a pattern like this, where there's this kind of wide separation of the peaks and the troughs. And if I were able to show you a higher note right off the bat, you would see it down here with kind of a close connection between those peaks and those troughs. So what happens when that vibration in air molecules gets to your ear? Well, sound vibrations are processed in the ear with a musical instrument that's inside your head called the cochlea. And the cochlea is this kind of amazing spiral-shaped organ inside of your ear. And it's laid out really exactly like this, like a snail shell. And as it happens, on this spiral-shaped part of your ear, there are actually, why isn't that? There we go. There are actually little hairs that vibrate in the air. And just like a guitar string, if we look at this part of the cochlea, we see these big, fat, floppy hairs. And just like the big, fat, floppy string on the guitar that's at the top, these respond best to, well, low notes that are vibrating slowly. And if we look a little bit further on the cochlea, as we move out on the spiral to this region here, we find these skinny little tight hair cells, just like that skinny little tight top string on a guitar, and those respond best to the high notes that we hear. And what that means then is that the whole cochlea, the first part of the ear that responds to sound, is laid out exactly like a guitar or even a piano, one might look at it, with low notes represented here at the tight part of the spiral, and then these high-pitched notes represented outside here at the outer part of the spiral. So as you play a note on the piano, that part of your cochlea becomes activated as those sound waves hit it. And of course, because that's the first part of your ear and the first part of your brain, really, that detects sound, damage to the cochlea can cause deafness. And as an interesting little side note, BrainHQ's co-founder, Dr. Michael Mahncke, actually invented a medical device called the cochlear implant, which can replace the cochlea for people who have profound deafness and can restore hearing to them in that case. And in fact, in another story we'll tell someday, that discovery was actually how Dr. Mahncke began his work on brain plasticity and BrainHQ. So once sound is processed in the cochlea, where does it go in the brain? Well, here's a little cartoon version of the cochlea. Again, the low notes here in blue and the high notes here in red and yellow. And as those hair cells move back and forth in response to vibrations in the air, they create electrical signals in nerves that run up to the brain. And the very first part of the brain that processes that sound here is called the primary auditory cortex, located kind of in a little valley here inside your brain. And it turns out that there is a map of sound in the brain, exactly like there's a map of sound on the piano and then on the cochlea. And when you look at the primary auditory cortex, you see, well, low notes are located here in blue on the left in this diagram, and middle notes here in red in the center, and the high notes all the way here in right in yellow. And actually, as it happens, as we're talking about history, I also should share that Dr. Mahncke was the first scientist to document that there was this kind of frequency map in the auditory cortex. He's had a very busy scientific career over his life, and he has had a great deal of study of sound and how it works at the brain. So if that's how the simplest kind of sounds come in and get processed by the brain, well, how does the brain get activated by music? And to talk about that, let's just briefly review our brain anatomy. This is the side view of the brain, and it's kind of color-coded into different regions. This region of the brain on the side is called the temporal cortex. It's generally involved in hearing and memory. The front of the brain is, perhaps unsurprisingly, called the motor cortex. It's involved in thinking and planning. And then there's two strips in the brain that relate to movement and then skin sensation right next to each other. And then here towards the back is the parietal cortex involved in attention. And then in the very back, there's the visual cortex that's involved in seeing. Now, if you had to guess, I'd like everyone to put into the chat, which part of the brain here do you think is going to be activated when we listen to music? I'll give people just a second, and then I'm going to show some brain imaging that tells us the answer. So type into your chat your guess, which part of the brain is going to be active related to music. And I'm going to show now how this actually works out. Now, this is a wonderful video that was created by some scientists in Sweden who were studying brain activation in response to music. And they used some advanced imaging techniques that let them show the whole brain activity that was happening as a person heard music. And in this case, we're going to hear a tango. So let me start this video. I'm going to advance it just a tiny bit here to get it started. You're seeing the brain start to light up as the music starts. Oh, look at that. So what you immediately see is that as a person is listening to this music, this tango music, in our case, for the first time, we see that actually virtually the entire brain is lighting up. So whatever you put into the chat, I guarantee you actually had the right answer, because listening to music is a whole brain activity. And if we go back through the parts of the brain, we can understand why that's true. The temporal lobe, well, it gets activated as you hear the music, but it also gets activated if you're remembering the music, if you've perhaps heard it before. The frontal cortex, which is involved in thinking and planning, well, that gets activated when you're thinking about what the music means to you. And the motor cortex gets activated if you've done any musical training, because even if you're not actively playing an instrument, it gets activated as you imagine, hey, what's it like to play this piece of music? Somatosensory cortex, which relays information from your skin, the same way, it gets activated from the feeling of playing the music. The parietal cortex, which is involved in attention, well, that gets activated because you're paying attention to the music. And finally, the visual cortex gets activated because for many people, even though music is something we hear, it activates thoughts and images in our mind as well. And that's why music ends up being such a powerful experience for many people, is because it's activating so much of the brain in this way. So let's dig into a little bit more to what music is, and that will tell us a little bit more about why that's true. So what is music composed of? Well, we have an actual music instructor on the line here, so we'll be able to talk with her about that more in a minute. But for me, I think, and for a lot of people who think about the brain, we might start with something very simple. Music is composed of rhythm and pitch, and then forward prediction. So what do I mean by rhythm? Well, here's a little song here that we're showing written out in musical notes. And if you don't read music, no problem at all. What I mean by rhythm is simply the timing of these notes as we move through time. And I'll just clap this for you because you might want to hear it and see what it sounds like. So the rhythm of this particular tune goes like this. That's what that written out music shows the musician. That's the rhythm with which they should play the music. Now, the second aspect of music that's important to the brain is pitch. It's actually the frequency of the notes. And again, that's shown on this musical scale right here, and a musician can read it, but I'll do one step better, and I'm not Taylor Swift, but I'll sing this little bit of music to you. It goes like this. Happy birthday to, that's the happy birthday to, and this song is Happy Birthday. So you've heard the rhythm and the pitch. But for a neuroscientist, one of the most interesting parts of music is that it actually causes your brain to make predictions. Now, I've sung a little bit of that song to you, and I wonder if you can guess what part comes next. And just about everyone on this webinar today, I think, can guess that the next little bit of the song that comes out is, well, to you, because it goes, happy birthday to you. Now, why is that? Why is it that when we hear that first little bit of rhythm and that first little bit of music and even those words, our brain can instantly predict what happens next? And I think that was probably many people's experience when we were playing Name That Tune a moment ago, that you get to a certain point in the song and you know immediately what it's going to sound like next. Well, that is fundamentally what we mean by forward prediction. The experience that you're having of that rhythm and that sound makes your brain predict what's going to happen next. And in fact, that happens through what we think of here at BrainHQ as brain plasticity. The brain actually, through hearing that song over and over again, I've heard it more than 50 times in my life, as it turns out. And even because we've sung it so many times, many of us have been to lots of birthday parties, we've probably sung the song more often than we've heard it played to ourselves. All of that intensive practice of producing the music and listening to the music has caused an enormous rewiring in our brain, where as soon as we hear a part of that little melody, we know exactly what's going to happen next. So that's brain plasticity. And if you're a user of BrainHQ, you've probably heard us talk about brain plasticity quite a lot here. That's how the brain rewires itself through experience and learning. And of course, that brain plasticity, that actually is basically how the brain stores memory. And it includes structural changes in the brain, functional changes in the brain, even chemical changes in the brain. All of those have happened just by listening and singing happy birthday throughout your entire life. Now, how does music change the brain? Well, in order for the brain to change, the brain needs two things, and music supplies them both. The first thing is that the brain needs a reason to change. The brain only changes when it needs to. It doesn't change if there's no reason to change. But music gives us two things. It requires speed. If we can't hear the notes at the pace that they're being played, we can't hear the music very well, and so our brain will want to rewire itself to hear the music better. It requires accuracy. If we can't tell the difference between two notes, well, our brain needs to rewire itself so we can hear the difference between those two notes and hear the melody that's being played. The second thing the brain needs is the ability to change, the reason to change and the ability to change. The brain only changes when it's allowed to. And music actually gives us three great things that allow our brain to change. So the first is that when we hear music that we're interested in, we pay attention. And attention, it turns out, releases a neuromodulator called acetylcholine all throughout the brain here, shown in yellow. And what that neuromodulator does is it actually tells the brain something interesting is going on. You might want to rewire yourself so you can hear it or understand it or think about it and remember it better. The second thing that music gives us is novelty. If we're hearing a new or an interesting piece of music, our brain releases another neurotransmitter called noradrenaline. Again, this tells the brain something interesting is going on. You might need to rewire yourself so you can figure out what this is all about. And finally, reward. If this is a piece of music you find engaging and compelling and rewarding and you just fall in love with, as so many of us do with our favorite music, well, your brain actually pumps a third neurotransmitter called dopamine, and that also tells the brain, hey, rewire yourself. Something good is going on. So music gives us all that stuff we need to rewire our brain. And in fact, study after study shows us exactly that musical training itself changes the brain. These are images of the brain that show the differences between a person who's trained with a lot of musical training and a person who hasn't. And what scientists see across studies is they see more gray matter volume across multiple parts of the surface of the brain. That tells us that the number and the health of the neurons is increasing. Scientists also see increased symmetry between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, showing better coordination as we listen to and play music. Scientists also see thicker connections between those left and right hemispheres, and they see thicker white matter. That's actually the insulation that kind of covers the cables of the brain. And they see that connections across the brain and in the spinal cord as well. So we can see that brain plasticity really drives an effect in the physical structure of the brain. But scientists can also see that it drives an effect in perception. So this is a great study that showed that the earlier a person starts music lessons and the more music lessons they take, well, the more their brain changes. What scientists looked at here was how accurately can the brain of an adult follow rapidly changing sounds. So a very simple task, basically measuring the speed and accuracy of information processing in the brain. And people who had no music training, shown here with 0 years of music training, they scored a 4 on this test. But people who had between 1 and 5 years of music training scored almost twice as high. And people who had 6 to 11 years, which is frankly a fair amount of music training, scored the highest of all. And what that shows us is that music training has rewired the brain, as we just saw, but it's changing how we perceive the auditory world and how the auditory parts of our brain works. And even better, studies have shown that training with music can improve cognitive function. So musical training has actually been studied in a brain health intervention in older adults. So one study took a bunch of people and asked half of them to do music training. They did twice a week, an hour per session of singing and drumming. So easy things that almost anyone can learn. And they compared that to another half of the people that did physical exercise. Now, we know that physical exercise is good for your body health. And if you've come to other BrainHQ Academy webinars, you know that physical exercise is pretty good for brain health as well. But what did scientists see when they compared these things? Well, they found that music training showed significantly greater benefits for people on overall cognitive function and verbal fluency. That's the ability to sort of find a word at the tip of your tongue. And it's probably because that music training trained the brain to be faster and more accurate. And what that shows us is, hey, you don't have to be Tony Bennett, you don't have to be Jack Costanzo to benefit from musical training. Just this little bit of musical training that people did helped them. Now, I can't help but compare musical training to BrainHQ a little bit at this point because, I work at BrainHQ and I helped invent these brain training exercises. So how is BrainHQ similar to musical training? Well, BrainHQ, like musical training, trains the brain to be fast and accurate. If you're going to do music training, you might learn to sing a song. And again, I said I wasn't Taylor Swift, but I'll take a swing at this anyway. This particular song goes like this. I know you were trouble when you walked in. That was a great pop hit just a few years ago for Taylor Swift, and you probably know she's one of the biggest musical stars in the world right now. But that song goes pretty fast. She sings it faster than I do, and it's got, some nice melodic change to it. And of course, she sings it more accurately than I do. But what is BrainHQ? And we know that kind of music training, of course, improves brain health. But how about what does BrainHQ do? Well, if you've done the exercise auditory sweeps, you might have heard this sound, and let me play it. So that's two little quick whistle sounds. And if you've done the exercise, you know you have to say that the first one went up and the second one went down. Now, that starts off at a pretty slow level. But if you train on BrainHQ quite a bit, your brain's going to get faster and more accurate, and you'll be able to do it quite accurately with quick sounds like this. Now, just as music training encourages the brain to get faster and more accurate, BrainHQ training does as well to drive the kind of benefits that BrainHQ drives. And in fact, scientists have looked at this in animal models. Here's a young rat. And when you look in the brain of a young rat, what we're looking here is this auditory cortex that you might remember me mentioned. And the blue regions are areas of the rat brain that are quick and accurate. Now here's an older rat who's just been living in her cage for about 2 years. That's how about long it takes for rats to get old. And as we look at those brains, in red we see parts of the brain that are noisy. They're no longer quick and accurate the way the young rat brain was. But if you put that old rat through, well, BrainHQ training for rats, and you'll be delighted to know that that exists, what you see is that rat brain in that older rat gets quick and accurate again, just like the brain of a young rat. And it's by training the rat to get fast and accurate that we can do that. And I think I'll wrap up there and just say, hey, remind people that, hey, we were inspired in many ways by musical training, by building the auditory exercises from BrainHQ. They're designed to rewire the brain and sharpen cognitive function and improve everyday life in that way. And if you've been doing BrainHQ exercises in the auditory system, fantastic. And if you haven't, well, this is a good excuse to start. So with that, I'm going to stop my slides and I'm going to kick it over to a chat with Lois. And Lois, are you there with us?
I am here.
Oh, fantastic. It's so nice to see you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I learned a lot, Henry, from listening to you.
Well, it's very kind of you. There are parts of it that I'm like, well, I'm saying this and a music teacher is online, so she might need to correct me a little bit as we go. But that's wonderful. We can hear a little bit from your musical experience and a little bit from my brain health experience. Why don't you kick us off and just tell us a little bit more about your own background in music and music education?
Sure. Well, I started lessons when I was 4.
Wow.
I'm not sure piano lessons for a 4-year-old are the best thing, but that's what happened to me. And so I've been doing this for, I hate to tell you how many decades. And eventually, well, not even eventually, over the time of my growing up years, it didn't seem as if there was anything else I was going to do.
Wow.
Music was what I was going to do.
So
it was part of my identity. It becomes part of your identity, I think. And then,
yeah,
it needs you and you need it.
And that makes total sense, because when we think about brain plasticity here, the way we think that a person's identity is formed is really through the rewiring of the brain that happens throughout their life. Everything that a person does rewires their brain a little bit. So when you talk about music being part of your identity, I get that completely from a brain science perspective.
Good. Anyway, I went on to get a Bachelor of Music at the University of Manitoba. I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada.
Okay.
I'm still a Canadian. And I moved uh, fairly early adulthood to the United States. I got married. And there was a big hiatus in my musical education at that point. I started teaching quite young, and I was teaching at that point, range of students, but I wasn't really studying. And it was only when I started moving around. I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and then in Halifax, Nova Scotia,
Oh, wow.
and then in Kansas City, Missouri, and then finally here in Washington, D.C. And every place I went, I would find a harpsichord teacher, and there were some wonderful ones. But my education resumed when my child got older, and I went to graduate school at the University of Maryland. And it was interesting because it had no harpsichordist, so I studied with fabulous harpsichord teacher who taught at St. John's College in Annapolis. I don't know if you know it, but it's
I do.
the great book school. So they teach everything. The curriculum was developed by the philosopher Mortimer Adler, and they teach everything sort of from original sources and in terms of great works. And after I was still studying at the University of Maryland. I was studying forte piano as my instrument, so I became kind of an early keyboard expert. And I enjoyed it, but I loved my lessons, and I loved St. John's. So after a while, I got a part-time job teaching their sophomore music class at St. John's. And I'm mentioning this because it's one of the things that I think contributed to what started to happen to my rather narrow musician's view. It started to broaden, and it started me thinking in slightly different ways, and probably more in depth in a way. And then I, as many musicians do, you have 6 jobs, you just paste a career together. So I continued to have a home studio, and I was teaching there. And then I got hired at the Levine School of Music, which is now called Levine Music. They rebranded themselves. I was hired to teach piano, harpsichord, and music theory.
Okay.
And it was a great place. I fell in love with it immediately. It's community education, so they teach everything from 6 months old to 95, and they were open about new ideas, and they let me develop my own curriculum for teaching theory to adults, and so it opened up a whole new world. And from there, I kind of slid into administration without meaning to, and ended up being head of performance.
Okay.
Well, yeah, that was a huge, but I performed until a few years ago, and I decided that. And what I'm doing now is simply teaching. It's been a great pleasure to focus just on that and rid myself of all the other things.
Well, it's a delight to share your passion for music and all that experience with students. And I know from our conversations that you've taught a wide variety of students. Of course, I imagine from very young children, maybe some kids are learning piano at the age of 4, to older adults. And I wonder, what have you noticed about the similarities and differences about how younger and older people approach learning music?
It's vastly different, I think. I mean, children are, first of all, they're usually not saying, "Oh, please give me lessons." They might be mildly enthusiastic, but their parents decide for them. And they're used to learning new things. They're used to being taught. They're used to being, in fact, told what to do and accepting what they're told. So that they don't tend to question things very much. And also they're not impatient about, usually about wanting to learn something that's more challenging than it could be for them at that level. They adapt easily to the steps that are necessary. Adults, on the other hand, bring to their lessons all the knowledge and wisdom and habits, good and bad, that they've absorbed throughout their lifetimes, and they are impatient, and they are intellectually very ready to learn a lot at once.
Yep.
But it hits them like a ton of bricks when they say what it exactly takes to play.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so all encompassing. It's physical training, it's intense intellectual exercise when you're decoding, and particularly on a keyboard instrument when you're working with two hands at once.
Yes.
And you've got two staves with two different clefs, and somehow you have to absorb this and do it in real time, so it engages your auditory and your tactile and your brain, your eyes, and there has to be a sort of choreography of all that. It's
probably why it's so good for the brain, is all of that challenge, as you say. But like you say, it's a ton of bricks because you have to do it all at once.
Continue.
Yeah, I mean, there's that old slogan that I think a lot of people have heard, right? You can't teach an old dog new tricks. And of course, we don't believe that here at BrainHQ for 1 minute, but I wonder what your experience has been. I mean, what would you say the oldest person you've given music lessons to is?
He was 95 when he
95.
quit. He didn't die, he just quit because he moved. And for his 90th birthday, he gave a recital for his family. We worked on that so of course you can teach an old dog new tricks, but that's kind of an interesting thought, because you can teach them, certainly, and but those old habits of how they've done things in their lives, which maybe work very well for their profession, but maybe less well for learning the instrument. Practicing is not intuitive at all. It takes a very patient person to practice in a way that's actually helpful to them. And so, it's a constant sort of conversation about how they can change, not themselves, but some of their habits and really their state of being,
Yep. Well, that makes total sense. And you sort of mentioned some of the differences between a younger music student and an older music student. The older student might have more wisdom, more experience, more discipline than a younger student, but has, of course, has to work through the challenges. And many older adults are pretty good at a lot of things that they've worked on in their life, and so hitting the challenge of learning music is different. I wonder, how do you adapt your teaching to an older student compared to a younger student? Are there ways that you can help an older student, take advantage of those strengths to sort of become a musical student?
It's an interesting question, because I can't at this moment capture, both experiences side by side. It's been many, many years since I've taught children. As soon as I started getting more involved in administration, I switched to adults, because they really don't take as much care and feeding as children.
Maybe that's the most important lesson right there. It's a little bit easier to teach an adult.
Young people have to be challenged to do it. I mean, school is like that. They take tests. That they're not doing it for the sheer love of it. So they have to be prepared for recitals and competitions and that sort of thing. Whereas adults are there because they just really want this, and they love music. And so right there is a big difference. With adults, I like to lay out reading right from the beginning, and most specifically, rhythmic notation. I think rhythmic notation and rhythm itself, the measuring of it in, notes and measures and phrases and all of that, is the vessel that the pitches are poured into. And if they can feel that.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say it's so interesting to hear you say that because when we think about how we build brain health with brain training, we focus so much on speed of processing. And speed, of course, is about being quick, but it's also about just being able to accurately kind of segment things in time. And I think rhythm is so important for that. And sometimes we think of music all about pitch and melody, and we forget that rhythm is actually an incredibly important part of the experience, and it might be the part that's best for brain health.
I think it is. I think it's best for actually the physical training because I always have students who will say, well, I'm going to learn the notes and then I'll apply the rhythm
Oh,
afterwards.
wow.
And I have to gently turn them around because that never works. They
Mhm.
will not learn anything and their memories won't capture it. It
Yep,
won't mean anything unless it's poured into this structured, beat
yeah,
pattern.
that's
It's about showing up on time.
yes, that's exactly what the brain is about, and exactly about what music is about too. That's incredible. So I wonder, we talked a bit about the difference between younger people and older adults. Have you ever worked in music training with someone who has a brain health condition? Because of course, as we just talked about, the brain is key to understanding music, and people can have all kinds of things happen to their brains over the years. What's your experience been like with that as a teacher?
Well, I have quite an array of conditions in my studio, but I
Oh,
do actually have an adult, not one of the older ones. He's just around 50, I would say, who has a traumatic brain injury.
oh my goodness.
Um,
Yeah.
just a freak bicycle accident,
Yeah.
and maybe 10, 15 years ago. And he was an actuary. This
Oh
person
wow.
really has a brain,
Hmm.
a very precise, analytical brain, and then he has this injury. So I think people meeting him for the first time don't think immediately brain injury.
Hmm.
Motor skills aren't affected at all, speech not at all. In fact, intelligence, comes through very
Hmm.
clearly, sense of humor, but it was a frontal lobe injury, and
Yep.
he's lost executive function
Yeah.
completely,
That's common in the.
and a kind of what I guess is emotional intelligence, kind
Hmm.
of flat affect.
Hmm.
It's sadly fortunate that he doesn't feel the extreme tragedy of his
Uh,
condition. He's a
yeah.
little bit sort of blasé about it almost. But in terms of his music lessons,
Yeah.
every lesson is almost we start. I don't mean we start from the beginning in terms of teaching him how to read and that sort of thing, but he can't summon himself to practice. That is something he can't do. And
Yep.
without practice, usually it's hopeless.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you do have to practice
But
some.
he's so intelligent. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, you have to sort of keep it going. A lot more is learned in practice than really at the lesson, and he can't. So we take a piece of music, and I've taught him to do some kind of sort of rudimentary analysis of the piece just by looking at it. The rhythm, the structure, the form, the harmonies. He's kind of brilliant, so you can teach him these things. It doesn't stick. We have to,
Yep.
we do it again the next week, but he's always interested,
Yep.
and he'll always say something, come up with some connection that I haven't thought of,
Yeah.
because that's the way his brain works.
Yep.
So that's what we do in that lesson.
Incredible. I think musical education
The,
can be incredibly important for anyone on their brain health journey, whether it's a younger person looking to grow their brain health, an older person looking to maintain or even improve their brain health, and certainly a person in recovery like that. Um, so, one last question, and then maybe we'll take some questions from the audience a bit, which is,
sure.
often we're talking to folks about the benefits of music for brain health. And a very natural question comes up, which is, well, gosh, can anyone just learn music? I mean, seems like a lot of work. I have to buy an instrument. I mean, a pianoforte, a harpsichord. This is not something inexpensive. Maybe I have to find lessons. And, you teach in DC, which is a wonderful urban center, but, many people live somewhere where maybe they don't have access to a wonderful school like Levine. What advice would you have for someone who's kind of hearing this and thinking, hey, I'd like to incorporate music and learning music into my life, but boy, I'm not made of money and so forth and so on. Are
Well,
there simple ways people can
yeah.
start to take advantage of this?
First of all, Zoom and the pandemic has changed everything in terms of music lessons. I'm still teaching a lot of people on Zoom. Many people ended up preferring it. There's a
Oh, wow.
huge learning curve at first and a lot of, challenges to get over. And then we all adapted. They did and I did, and many of them love it. And I kind of like it too. So in terms of accessibility, that's taken care of. As far as the expense,
Well, let me ask a question. Let me ask a question a different way. What do you think the least expensive musical instrument a person might try and learn is if they wanted to incorporate some musical training?
You're asking the wrong person. No way.
I know it's not a harpsichord.
People will, no, it's a beginner. And my immediate thought is, yes, but if you hear a good instrument, you're going to develop in ways that you'll never develop if you're playing something that basically goes thud when you put, and I feel the same way about keyboards. So this is probably a question for somebody else, but
that makes
to say that. But in terms of can anybody learn to play music?
Yep.
Once again, maybe I'm not the best person, but here's what I think, because I've, had so much experience. Everything depends on motivation, and the motivation has to be somewhere a deep love or desire for music. I've had students, very accomplished in their lives, start and they'll say, I'm over 70. I've learned some new things over 70. I think it's very important to keep learning new things. I've learned to ski. I've learned to play golf. I've learned bridge. And now I want to learn music. And my heart sinks because
maybe they don't have enough love for music to quite stick with it.
The motivation isn't there. And I'll say, so when you were growing up, was there music in your family? Do you go to concerts? And if the answers to all of those things are, well, no, but, then I'm thinking,
but
this will be like ancient Greek to this person. They might be able to do it, but it won't stick because it won't mean anything. And that's maybe not fair, but I've seen it.
But I imagine your most happy student to show up then is someone who's 70 who said, I've loved music my whole life, but I've never had the time to pursue music lessons. And now I'm 70 and I have some time. That must be a student that just makes your heart leap with joy when they show up and they're ready to learn.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean that it's not hard for them.
Yep.
But the motivation is about music and about making music.
That makes sense.
And because it's so difficult, there has to be the desire.
Has to be the desire. But if the desire is there, the learning can happen.
To make it.
Yep.
Yeah.
The desire is there, the learning can happen. Well, hey, we've been chatting because you're such an interesting person to talk to and so full of knowledge and perspective. But Stephanie, we should take some questions from our audience. Are there some questions coming in that Lois and I might take about music and learning and brain health and things of that nature?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of people that have written in asking about functionally in the brain, but also as a performer, what is sort of the difference between like hearing music versus singing or playing some sort of a musical instrument? Like what's going on differently in each of those different situations?
I'll comment a little bit from brain science, and then maybe Lois can comment as someone who's listened to played music. From a brain science perspective, of course, playing music is going to activate the brain more because you're doing something with your hands or your mouth, as the case may be, as well as hearing music at the same time. But one interesting thing about listening to music is listening to music itself, as we saw from that image, that little movie, activates so much of the brain. And actually it can almost, it really does activate parts of the brain involved in performing as well, even if you're not performing, just because your brain starts to visualize what would it be like to sing to this, what would it be like to play it, what would it be like to dance to this. That activation that happens, we think of it as the imagination, but it represents real world brain activity that's happening across the brain. So they're really weirdly more similar than one might think. But Lois, what's been your experience as someone who both plays and listens? Do you feel your brain is doing different things? Are you in different states, or as a professional, these all end up being the same to you?
Almost the same. I think that when I hear somebody say, I love listening to music, it's so relaxing, that never occurs to me
That never
because it's
happens to
what,
you.
no, when I'm listening, I'm listening. I can't not listen. And in fact, I know that people play music while they're doing other things, but I've never been able to do that because my whole body is engaged, and brain and body. Performing music, though, is and performing in one's music room for oneself is different than performing in front of an audience. That is really a more all-encompassing
Yeah, for sure.
thing. I mean, because you're really, if you're performing in public, there's a great need for it to be, as smooth and accurate while communicating musically,
Yeah.
and staying in touch with your body so that it stays relaxed enough despite adrenaline,
Yep.
to do. It's just
It's a full
so
brain and a full body experience.
uh
Yeah.
yes,
It's
it
so
is.
interesting to hear you say that because when Dr. Merznick, BrainHQ's founder, talks about listening to music for brain health, one of the things he says is, hey, if it's in the background, nothing's going to happen in your brain. You're not paying attention. So what he gives people the advice is, hey, pick a piece of music, and if it's a very familiar one, pay all of your attention and try and hear something new in it, some nuance you haven't heard before. Or if it's a new
Yeah.
piece of music for you, again, give all that attention in and try and pick out the melody and try and pick out the rhythm and really make it a whole brain experience. So it sounds like what he tells people to do is, hey, listen to music as if you're an experienced performer, an experienced musician in that way. And that's probably what's best for brain health.
I would, yes. I get a little worried when people think that they can play, Mozart for their babies while they're
Oh,
sleeping and that something will
well,
happen. But
I have good news for you. That's been thoroughly debunked. So you don't
good,
need to worry
good.
about that anymore. Stephanie,
I
what
tell
other?
my
Oh,
I
sorry, go
tell my
ahead.
students, I give my students listening exercises sometimes. I'll I'll say, when you're, in the car and you're listening to the radio, whatever it is,
Nice.
see if you can pick out the meter. In other words, is it in 3? Is it in 4? Because then you're
Yep.
doing something when you listen.
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. My son is a musician as well, and he taught me how to do that. And it's sort of changed my experience of listening to music in the car.
Yeah.
Stephanie, what else? Do we have another couple of questions? I'm sure
Yeah,
we do.
absolutely. So we have a lot of people that are sort of asking about coming back to playing an instrument if they've taken a break from it.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
it something that they should do if they are interested in doing that? Is it better to go back and pick up an instrument that they already know and want to relearn, or would it be maybe more advantageous for them to pick up a different instrument? Those are the kinds of questions that we're getting a lot
That's a
in the
great
chat
set of
right now.
questions. I mean, Lois, what's been your experience with people sort of reactivating those old piano lessons in your case?
I've had both experiences. I have people who come back. Um, there's one sort of unique thing about harpsichord, and that is most people, have piano experience, no harpsichord. So they want to learn the harpsichord. It's a
Huh.
different instrument with different technique and all kinds of differences, but it's a keyboard instrument. And
Yep.
so they hit the ground running in that way. And some people really want to do that. Other people have played clarinet, at a very high level, and then decide to music that they want something else. And some of them do that because they fear that they'll never be as They
Ah,
won't be able to bring it up to the level it was, and therefore they should just do something else.
yep.
It's I've had both experiences. I would encourage anybody to do any of those things. Come back, for heaven's sake.
Come back is the
It's a
first
gift to
lesson,
have music
right?
in your life.
Come back is the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
lesson one way or the other. I think from a brain science perspective, both can be good. We think a lot about the value of new learning. So there's something really unique, I think, about having achieved a certain level of performance, let's say at the clarinet, and then saying, hey, I want to change directions and kind of build on that for the harpsichord. The brain loves that kind of new experience in that way.
Hmm.
That's wonderful. But I would never want to deter anyone from just becoming a great harpsichordist or a great clarinetist. Like you say, coming back is the great thing. So if you've been thinking about coming back to music, I hope this webinar is a wonderful excuse for you to do that. What else
Oh,
have we got,
yes.
Stephanie?
Yeah, we also talking sort of about going back from like harpsichord to piano. Are there skills that you can learn on one instrument that would translate to another instrument? Like if you did want to branch out, for example, would learning one instrument sort of bring your base knowledge up enough that learning a second or third instrument would go by faster?
Yes, in certain ways, absolutely. So, for instance, I'm thinking now of a student who was a very advanced clarinet player. He could read fluently in one clef. He also had a very developed ear.
Hmm.
Piano, in a way, is the worst for really developing your ear because it's all there. It's a button you push. Whereas if you're playing violin or you're playing a wind instrument or something, you have to make that tone. And so their pitch discernment, I think, is really good. They also have a real sense of how music goes, and if they've been advanced, they can look at a piece of piano music and hear it in their head before they even attempt it. That's a huge advantage.
Hmm.
So
Okay. Nice to start with that
yes, there's
foundation
there's a
then,
transfer.
and then
Yeah.
It's
down
nothing but helpful. Yeah.
but helpful. Okay.
Yeah, I'll also add, as somebody who plays a bunch of wind instruments, has been in pit orchestras before, from a technical standpoint, it's also advantageous because like I went from starting on flute and then you find out that a lot of the finger postures translate to saxophone, translate to clarinet, and so on and so
Yes.
forth.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that
So
that carried over very, very well as well.
Fantastic. We'll get
which
you on a
makes it
harpsichord next.
Yeah, right?
well, yeah. I mean that makes it very brave if they switch to a keyboard instrument. Um,
All right, we do have a couple of questions about tinnitus. How does tinnitus affect music training and your enjoyment of music? Is there a way to better enjoy music or take advantage of, active listening to music when you have a condition like tinnitus, for example?
Yeah, maybe I'll
I
just say a word or two about
have
tinnitus from a brain health perspective, and then I'll kick it over to you, Lois, from a musical perspective. As many people probably know, tinnitus is an incessant sense of, people say, ringing in the ears, right? You hear a note, you hear a musical tone, you hear a sound, and it may come and go, and in more severe cases, it is incessant. And some people can ignore it, but a lot of people find it really troublesome and even disabling. And from a brain science perspective, a remarkable number of mysteries about how this condition works. In my view, the best current theory is that it's occurring centrally in the brain, in the auditory cortex, as we talked about. And you might think of it almost as like spontaneous activity in the brain. And so the brain kind of gets turned on and can't quite turn itself off. And then you hear that as a tone or a noise or something like that. And the most interesting therapies that people are developing are basically brain plasticity therapies. How can we quiet down that part of the brain so it's not so spontaneously active? But it's a very active field of research. I mean, Lois, what's been your experience with teaching or with students who have that? And can you still enjoy music, or can music even be helpful with the condition?
Well, I can answer the second part, but not the first because I've never worked with anybody with tinnitus.
Hmm.
But I had and have a very wonderful colleague who developed it.
Mm.
And I've never talked in depth with him, but he's continued to play and teach.
Oh, good.
He doesn't just teach, he's a pianist, but he's also very involved in chamber music, and he runs an adult chamber music camp.
Hmm.
And um, so I gather from this that he has learned to adapt and obviously still not only enjoys music, but is able to teach it, which means he can actively listen and critique. But I've always wondered how one adapts. I'm very interested in the idea that training like that can quiet down an
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, no, as a brain plasticity person, I'd like to think that musical training over time might help that, but I need to be cautious when I say that. No one has proven that yet, but it seems to
Yeah.
me that as a scientist, there should be a relationship. Stephanie, should we take one more quick question and then wrap up? Do we have time for a brief one?
Yeah, we do have a couple of people who have written in asking about perfect pitch, what it is, can you develop it? Are you born with it?
Oh,
What's
okay.
the gossip about perfect pitch? How's the hammer going to come down on that one?
Lois, I'll be curious
Okay.
to hear that. Yeah, from you, and then I'll offer a thought or two as a brain scientist, and we'll make that our last question. Great last question, Stephanie. What's your
Okay.
experience been like? Do you have
Well,
perfect pitch, Lois?
I do,
Oh my
but
goodness. Okay.
okay, but I think there's perfect pitch and perfect pitch is what I
Okay.
think. Okay. As I said, I started when I was 4 years old,
Yep.
and as soon as I learned the names of the actual pitches, I could name the pitch from wherever I was in the room, and they I have I guess it's a kinesthetic sort of connection. They were lifesavers to me. They were like red and blue, and they had different tastes, and
Wow.
um, different intervals had different tastes. So I have that very connected to the piano.
That's so
But I
interesting.
know people who can listen to a dial tone, or a car horn, and can name the pitch. And I also know people who can out of the air sing B flat, uh, so I think there seem to be degrees. And
Yep.
I think in my case, the combination of the kinesthesia plus early training developed something, because I do know that Suzuki, you know, tiny little Suzuki violinists, one of the first things they learn is how to sing A out of the air.
Okay.
They can be taught.
Yep.
And from that, they can have very good relative pitch, if not complete perfect pitch. So now I'd like to hear from you
That's amazing. Well,
what your experience is.
your experience is so interesting in its relationship to neuroscience. I'll say a word more about that in a moment. Generally, what I think we think in neuroscience is so many people think that perfect pitch is like innate, like you have genetics for it or not, and there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Exactly like your experience shows. Lots of people, a fair number of people who have intense musical training at a young age will develop it. So we still think of it as a learned ability rather than an innate ability. No one has perfect pitch if they never take a music lesson, right? But it does seem like the earlier you do take your music lessons, the more likely you are to develop perfect pitch. And in that sense, as a neuroscientist, it always seems a little bit like learning a language. Every kid learns how to speak pretty much automatically as long as they're exposed to language and will become a fluent native speaker. And we can all learn languages later on, in fact, become pretty good at it. But it is different how an adult seems to learn a language than a kid a bit in that way. And so I think neuroscientists think there's some similarity between that learning of a language and that learning of pitch, that if we're exposed to it at the right age and with the right environment, our brain will rewire itself in that way. But the comments you make about kinesthesia and synesthesia are super interesting as well. As many people may know on our listeners, synesthesia is the experience in the brain where you have a sensation, let's say from hearing, but it generates a visual sense or a skin sense as well, and those senses all get combined. People talk sometimes about tasting colors, for example, and I think there's something super
Yeah.
interesting that with perfect pitch as well, that it probably relates to this very intense experience that's created, and then the brain categorizes it in different ways. You kind of mentioned those sort of lifesaver kind of feelings, and that as a result of that scaffolding where the brain is categorizing this in a really complex way, well, then you have a really complex ability that comes out of it. So that's absolutely fascinating, Lois. Thank you for sharing that. Stephanie, we should probably wrap up. We're a little bit over now, but this has been such a fantastic conversation. Lois, I'm so glad you were able to join us. And I should say at the end here, for those people who are still with us, that the reason I'd asked you to join is because you're a wonderful music teacher and you've been teaching my mom harpsichord lessons for many years now. And I think that's just been a really important
Yes,
part of her life and a really important part of health and so many things. So just a personal thank you for that.
sure. My great pleasure.
And thanks
I
for
hope I
coming.
didn't babble too much. Thank you.
No, it's been fascinating. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge and your wisdom and your experience with us. Stephanie, let's wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, Henry, Lois, thank you so much for joining us today and for having those wonderful discussions that everybody could participate in and answering all those questions. Sorry to everybody who submitted a question and didn't get an answer. I tried to do my best to sum as many of those up as I could. As for our next webinar, on May 15th, we are going to be holding a webinar called Understanding Progress within BrainHQ. So for those of you out there with questions about stars, percentiles, make sure you keep an eye out for that invitation. That webinar will be occurring on May 15th. Other than that, I think that about wraps it up. Henry, Lois, do you have any last words that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, it's such a
I will.
fascinating topic. Thank you, Lois.
I'll just say that I'm underlining my encouragement. I think music is a gift in anybody's life, and if you can have it in that sort of meaningful way of actually making it, then you've got something that will literally be a lifesaver.
I couldn't agree more strongly. It's a gift for the spirit and a gift for the brain as well. So thanks for chatting about both sides of that with us today. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for hosting us, Stephanie.
Of course, have a great day and happy brain training. Have a good time listening to music too today and think back to this webinar and some of the lessons you may have learned. Right.